Welcome to the era where the purple ocean isn't just a sea of light, but a reservoir of untold stories. It's 2026, and while the world cheers for BTS's triumphant return to the global stage, a thick veil still hides the scars behind the superstardom. Have you ever wondered what happens when the stadium lights fade and the deafening cheers turn into a haunting silence? What price did they actually pay for a seat at the table of legends? We're peeling back the glitter to reveal the grit, the tears, and the shadows that even the cameras couldn't catch. Are you ready to see the human side of the gods of K-pop? Let's dive deep into the mysteries that define their legacy. Number 7. RM, the heavy crown of intellectual isolation. In the neon-soaked streets of Seoul and the high-rise boardrooms of the UN, Kim Namjoon stands as a titan, a leader who bridged the gap between East and West. Yet, in 2026, the reflection in the mirror reveals a man who has spent over a decade navigating the claustrophobic corridors of intellectual isolation and the crushing weight of being a nation's spokesperson. People see the brilliant philosopher-rapper with an IQ of 148, but few see the dark nights in his studio where the silence is so loud it becomes deafening, a direct consequence of being the one who always has to have the right answer. Since their debut, RM wasn't just leading a group, he was carrying the cultural identity of South Korea on his shoulders, a burden that forced him to suppress his own rebellious, raw impulses to fit the mold of a global diplomat. This isn't just about the stress of a leader, it's about the systematic erasure of Kim Namjoon to preserve the RM entity. Think back to the Mono era. That wasn't just an artistic choice, it was a cry for help from a man drowning in a sea of public expectations. In 2026, as the group navigates their post-military chapter, the scars of his early 20s have resurfaced as a profound existential crisis. He has often spoken about RM being a character he plays, but the dark side of this is the dissociation that occurs when you can no longer tell where the performance ends and your real life begins. Imagine the psychological toll of having every word you speak analyzed by millions, not just for its meaning, but for its political correctness and its impact on stock prices. This is a man who loves art galleries because they are the only places where he can feel like a ghost, invisible and unjudged. Yet even there, the cameras find him. The darkness here isn't a scandal, it's the profound loneliness of being a visionary in a world that only wants you to be a product. He has lived a life where his mistakes are global headlines and his growth is a public commodity. The pressure to remain the mature one meant he never got to be reckless, never got to be young, wild, and free in the way his lyrics often dreamed of. Behind the sophisticated speeches lies a history of intense self-loathing and the constant fear that if he falters for even a second, the entire house of cards, BTS, Big Hit, the industry, might come crashing down. We talk about the success of Butter and Dynamite, but we rarely talk about the nights RM spent pacing his room, wondering if he had traded his soul for a seat at the Grammys. His journey is a testament to the fact that the higher you climb, the thinner the air becomes. And in 2026, Namjoon is still learning how to breathe without a mask. Can you imagine the sheer exhaustion of being a symbol instead of a human being for 13 years straight? The shadows of his leadership are long, cast by the very light he brought to the world, leaving him to wander in a mental labyrinth where the only exit is a version of himself he hasn't met yet. It's a haunting reality. The man who taught the world to love yourself spent years struggling to even like the person he saw in the mirror. Number 6. Jin, the mask of the eternal optimist. When you think of Kim Seok-jin, you immediately think of the worldwide handsome charm, the flying kisses, and the infectious dad jokes that have brightened the darkest days for millions of armies across the globe. But as we stand here in 2026, looking back at the long road he's traveled, a much darker and more somber reality begins to emerge from behind that perfect porcelain smile. For over a decade, Jin has perfected the art of emotional camouflage, acting as the group's emotional shield while systematically burying his own anxieties and insecurities deep beneath the surface. The dark side of being the oldest member in a culture that prizes hierarchy is the unspoken obligation to never show weakness, to be the unshakable pillar even when your own foundation is cracking. We've seen him laugh off mistakes and play the role of the goofy young, but behind the scenes, Jin has struggled with a profound sense of imposter syndrome that would have broken a lesser man. Entering Big Head as an aspiring actor with zero background in dance or professional singing, he was thrust into a world of hyper-competition where he felt like he was constantly playing catch-up. Imagine the psychological warfare of being told you're the visual while you're pouring blood, sweat, and tears into mastering choreography that your younger members pick up in half the time. This pressure led to a hidden history of grueling, solitary practice sessions, often lasting until the sun came up, just so he wouldn't be the weak link in the eyes of the public. But the darkness goes even deeper than work ethic. It's about the erasure of his true personality for the sake of group harmony. In rare, vulnerable moments, Jin has hinted that the Jin we see on camera is a carefully constructed persona designed to lighten the mood, a character that often stands in stark contrast to the quiet, introspective, and sometimes melancholy Kim Sik-jin. By 2026, the toll of this toxic positivity has become more apparent. He spent years being the member who sacrificed his own screen time and lines for the sake of the group's sound, a silent martyr who swallowed his pride for the greater good. The emotional exhaustion of being the one who must be happy so that others can feel okay is a heavy burden that few can fathom. Think about the period around the Abyss release. That wasn't just a beautiful song, it was a desperate confession of burnout and a feeling of unworthiness despite achieving heights no one else could reach. The industry's relentless pace and the public's demand for constant entertainment meant that Jin rarely had the space to process his own grief or exhaustion. He had to be the worldwide handsome, even when he felt invisible inside. In the quiet hours of his mandatory service and the subsequent return to the limelight, the facade began to thin, revealing a man who has spent a lifetime being the comedic relief to hide a soul that is deeply sensitive and often lonely. The reality of Jin's journey is a haunting reminder that the person laughing the loudest is often the one carrying the heaviest silence. He became a master of the mask, but in doing so, he faced the terrifying risk of losing himself in the very character he created to protect his brothers. In 2026, as we peel back the layers, we see that his greatest strength wasn't his humor, but his ability to endure the darkness of his own self-doubt while ensuring that the light never left the eyes of those around him. Can you feel the weight of a smile that is used as armor? Number 5. Sugar, the agony of the starving artistry. Behind the razor-sharp tongue of Min Yoongi and the cold, calculated genius of the world's most sought-after producer lies a history written in scars, physical pain, and a mental battleground that has raged since his underground days in Daegu, a level so brutal it nearly extinguished his light before it ever reached the global stage. While many fans know about his shoulder injury from a delivery accident, the true dark side is the psychological trauma of being a starving artist in an industry that views you as a product. For years, Yoongi lived in a state of constant high-alert anxiety, forced to choose between a 1,000 won bowl of noodles or the bus fare home, a trauma that didn't just disappear once he became a millionaire. In fact, the sudden influx of wealth and fame triggered a visceral reaction. The transition from Min Yoongi, the survivor, to Sugar, the idol, brought on a crushing wave of depression and social anxiety that he documented in his first mixtape, August D. This wasn't just edgy branding, it was a raw, unfiltered transmission from a man who felt like a glitch in the Matrix. The dark reality of his journey is the performance paradox. The more he poured his pain into his music, the more the world demanded of him, essentially forcing him to commodify his own suffering for public consumption. There is a haunting detail in his history regarding his shoulder surgery in 2020. For years, he performed in agonizing physical pain, hiding it so perfectly that no one knew his arm was practically paralyzed during some of the group's most intense world tours. Imagine the sheer mental grit required to dance to Idol while your nerves are screaming in protest, all because you are terrified that showing weakness will lead to being discarded. By 2026, the reflection of his path reveals a man who has spent more time in the dark room of his mind than in the sunlight. His lyrics often speak of the shadow that grows alongside the light, and for Yoongi, that shadow was a deep-seated fear of the future. He has lived with the hungry ghost syndrome. No matter how many day songs or Billboard #1s he achieved, the trauma of his impoverished youth kept him in a state of perpetual workaholism that led to severe burnout. He didn't know how to stop because, in his mind, stopping meant returning to that cold floor in Daegu. This is the dark side of ambition. It's a fire that keeps you warm, but eventually starts to burn you alive. The industry saw a hit maker, but his brothers saw a man who would lock himself in a windowless studio for days, forgetting to eat or sleep, chasing a perfection that he felt was the only thing keeping him relevant. The darkness of Suga is the reality that his greatest hits were often born from his lowest points, creating a cycle where pain became a prerequisite for success. In 2026, we see a more peaceful Yoongi, but the scars on his shoulder and the depth in his eyes tell the story of a man who had to walk through hell twice, once to get famous and once to survive the fame itself. He fought the demons of poverty, the demons of the industry, and the demons of his own mind, often at the same time. Can you imagine the exhaustion of having to turn your most private agonies into a 4-minute track just to feel like you still have a voice? Number 4. J-Hope, the suffocating weight of the sunshine persona. Jungkook, the man the world knows as the son of BTS, the hope of the fandom, and the dancer who moves with a fluidity that seems almost supernatural, hides a reality that is far more mechanical and pressurized than the bright smile suggests. As we stand in 2026, we have to look at the dark side of the smile, a psychological phenomenon where an individual is forced to be the emotional anchor for millions while their own internal world is crumbling. For over a decade, J-Hope has been the group's performance leader, a title that sounds prestigious but carries a terrifying burden. He is the one responsible for the perfection of their movement, the one who must be the disciplinarian, and the one who can never, ever have a bad day. The darkness of Hoseok's journey lies in the systematic suppression of his human volatility to maintain the J-Hope brand. Think about the transition from the street-dancing Smile Hoya in Gwangju to the global superstar. It wasn't just a career jump, it was an identity transplant. In the early days, he almost left the group, a forgotten detail that highlights just how close he came to breaking under the pressure of the idol trainee system. But even after success arrived, the sunshine persona became a gilded cage. In 2026, looking back at his solo debut, Jack in the Box, we saw the first real crack in the mask, the burning desire to show the world that he is also made of fire, grit, and darkness. But the industry's demand for his hopeful energy meant that for years he had to swallow his anger, his fatigue, and his sorrow. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from being the person everyone looks to for energy. When the group was tired, Hoseok had to be the one to clap his hands and say, "One more time." When the world was in a pandemic, he had to be the one to dance and bring cheer. This constant output of high-frequency energy led to a hidden struggle with emotional depletion. Behind the scenes, staff have often described a quiet, cold version of Hoseok, not because he is unkind, but because he is so utterly drained of his social battery that he becomes a ghost of himself. The pressure to be hope is a psychological trap. If he is sad, he feels he is failing his name. If he is angry, he is breaking the promise of his persona. Imagine the mental toll of having your very stage name dictate your allowed range of human emotions. In 2026, the reflection of his military service and return reveals a man who is tired of being the sun. He has spent years in the practice room until his joints ached and his vision blurred, driven by a perfectionism that borders on the obsessive-compulsive, all because he felt that as the dance leader, any mistake made by the group was his personal failure. This self-inflicted guilt is the shadow that followed him from the underground clubs to the Grammys. He became a master of his craft, but at the cost of his own spontaneous joy. The reality of J-Hope is the story of a man who gave the world his light so they wouldn't have to see his darkness, leaving him to sit alone in the shadows of the very stage he conquered. Can you imagine the loneliness of being the world's source of hope while wondering if there's anyone left to give that hope back to you? Number 3. Jimin, the lethal pursuit of an invisible perfection. If there is one member whose dark side is etched into the very fibers of his physical being, it is Park Jimin. As we look at him in 2026, a global fashion icon and a solo powerhouse, we're actually looking at a survivor of a brutal, self-imposed regime that the public rarely discusses in full detail. The darkness for Jimin wasn't an external enemy, it was the man in the mirror. From the moment he joined the lineup as the final member, Jimin lived with a haunting last-place complex, a terrifying fear that he was never quite good enough, never quite lean enough, and never quite talented enough to stand beside his brothers. This led to what is perhaps the most heartbreaking chapter in BTS history, the extreme dieting and physical overexertion during the blood, sweat, and tears era. Jimin once confessed to eating only one meal every 10 days to achieve a specific, sharp look, a fact that is often glossed over as dedication, but was actually a dangerous dance with self-destruction. Imagine the psychological torture of being one of the world's greatest performers while your body is literally starving, your brain is foggy from lack of nutrients, and you are fainting in the practice room. But the industry didn't stop him. It applauded the results. This is the dark reality of the K-pop machine. It rewards the symptoms of a breakdown as professionalism. By 2026, the scars of this era have evolved into a deep-seated perfectionism that borders on the agonizing. Jimin is known to lock himself in vocal booths for hours, recording a single line hundreds of times until his voice cracks, driven by a voice in his head that tells him he's a fraud. This imposter syndrome is his shadow. Even as he topped the Billboard Hot 100 as a soloist, sources close to the group hinted that he spent the night of his victory not celebrating, but obsessing over a slight vocal pitch inconsistency in a live performance from years prior. The physical toll is just as dark. His history of chronic neck and shoulder pain isn't just from dancing, it's the physical manifestation of carrying the world's expectations on a frame he once tried to shrink into nothingness. He has spent years being the filter for everyone else's desires, changing his hair, his body, and his singing style to match a shifting ideal, often losing the core of Park Jimin in the process. There is a profound melancholy in his eyes that even his most angelic smiles can't hide, a reflection of the years he spent hating the very body that made him a legend. In the quiet moments of 2026, Jimin faces the challenge of loving a version of himself that isn't performing. Can you imagine the sheer mental exhaustion of being a masterpiece that is constantly trying to paint over its own canvas because it thinks it's a mistake? The darkness of Jimin is the silent scream of a man who conquered the world, only to realize his toughest battle was convincing himself he deserved to be in it. Number 2. V. The silent suffocation of a free spirit. When we look at Kim Tae-young in 2026, we see a man who radiates the aura of a classic Hollywood noir star, mysterious, soulful, and effortlessly cool. But the dark side of V's journey is the story of a vibrant, eccentric soul that was slowly, systematically dimmed by the cold machinery of global superstardom. Tae-young entered the industry as the secret member, a hidden weapon kept in the shadows until the very last moment. And in many ways, that sense of being hidden or misunderstood has defined his entire career. The darkness here is the asphyxiation of individuality. Early on, Taeyang was celebrated for his 4D personality, his unique way of thinking, and his playful, unpredictable nature. However, as BTS transitioned from a K-pop group to a global political and social symbol, that spontaneity became a liability in the eyes of the corporate machine. We witnessed a visible, haunting transformation around 2018. The winter bear began to retreat. The boy who used to make funny faces and play with his members became a man who often stared into the distance with eyes that seemed to have seen too much. Imagine the psychological trauma of having your natural curiosity and weirdness policed because you are now a representative of Korea. This led to a period of profound emotional withdrawal that the public mistook for a coolness. Behind the scenes, Taeyang was battling a deep sense of loss. The loss of his grandmother, his close friends, and most importantly, the loss of his freedom to be unfiltered. He lived in a state of hypervigilance, where a single misunderstood expression or a brief moment of not smiling was weaponized by the media as a bad attitude. This pressure created a glass wall between him and the rest of the world. In 2026, looking back at his solo work like Layover, you can hear the echoes of that isolation. It's the sound of a man who found comfort in the shadows because the spotlight felt like a searchlight. The dark reality is that Taeyang often felt like a commodity in a museum, admired for his face, but silenced in his soul. He spent years feeling like he had to tame himself to fit the group's increasingly polished image, leading to bouts of loneliness so intense he would often spend his free time in complete silence, away from the noise of the industry. The industry wanted a visual god, but Kim Tae-young just wanted to be a photographer, a jazz lover, and a grandson. The friction between his true self and the V persona created a mental fatigue that few can comprehend. Can you imagine the pain of being loved by millions for a version of yourself that feels like a prison?
Number 1. Jungkook, the stolen childhood of a golden paradox. At the pinnacle of this list stands the golden maknae, Jungkook. But in 2026, the gold has a dark, oxidized underbelly that tells a haunting story of a stolen identity. The darkest side of Jungkook's legend isn't a secret scandal. It is the total erasure of his formative years. Imagine being 15 years old, an age where most kids are failing math tests and having their first awkward crushes, and instead being thrust into a training center where your every movement, meal, and breath are monitored by corporations and cameras. Jungkook didn't just grow up in the spotlight, he was raised by it. He is a human experiment of the idol system, a boy who learned how to be a superstar before he learned how to be a person. This led to a profound psychological crisis that peaked as he entered his mid-20s. The realization that Jungkook is essentially a composite of his 6 older brothers and the expectations of millions of fans. He has often stated that he doesn't know who he is without BTS, which is a chilling admission of a hollowed-out self. The darkness manifests in his radical pursuit of autonomy through physical change. The tattoos that cover his skin and the piercings that once shocked the industry weren't just style choices. In the context of 2026, we see them as a desperate, silent rebellion, a way to reclaim ownership over a body that had been public property since puberty. Behind the golden facade lies a man who struggled with a deep existential void. Because he achieved everything by the age of 20, he was left wandering a world where nothing felt real or earned. This led to periods of intense social withdrawal and a reckless streak where he pushed boundaries just to feel a spark of genuine human emotion outside the sterilized idol environment. He lived with the perfect son syndrome, where a single mistake, like a night out with friends or a minor traffic accident, was treated by the public like a national betrayal. The weight of being the center of the world's biggest group meant that Jungkook could never afford to be mediocre, and that pressure created a man who is his own harshest jailer. In 2026, his solo journey revealed an artist who is incredibly talented, but haunted by the fear that if the music stops, there is nothing left inside the shell. He sacrificed his adolescence, his privacy, and his right to make mistakes on the altar of global success. The golden maknae is the ultimate sacrifice of the K-pop industry, a boy who gave up his chance to grow up so he could become an eternal idol. Can you imagine the terrifying silence of realizing you've conquered the entire world, only to find out you never actually got to meet yourself?
And there you have it, the 7 hidden chapters of a legacy that redefined the world. As we look at the global phenomenon of BTS in 2026, it's easy to get lost in the sea of purple lights and the record-breaking statistics. But as we've seen tonight, behind every high note and every perfectly synchronized move lies a human story of sacrifice, identity loss, and a relentless battle against the very machine that created them. These aren't just superstars. They are 7 individuals who traded their normal lives to become the voice of a generation, carrying shadows that grow longer with every new spotlight. The question that remains for us, the viewers and fans, is a heavy one. At what point does our demand for perfection become the architect of their pain? As they continue to navigate this uncharted territory of global fame, perhaps the greatest gift we can give them is the permission to be flawed, to be tired, and to be human. Their journey reminds us that even in a world of dynamite and butter, the most powerful thing you can do is survive the darkness and find your own light. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the grit behind the glitter. If this journey moved you, don't forget to reflect on the human cost of the art we consume every day. Stay curious, stay empathetic, and we'll see you in the next deep dive.